I work in a few different areas. I've been doing some work recently on time use and changes in work arrangements, specifically how the transition, the shift to remote work has impacted couples' division of labor. I've worked on time use and parenting. This project fits into kind of a broader set of studies that focus on the transition to parenthood and the consequences for couples, in particular, the gendered economic costs of parenthood. And I have a few streams of work within this broad bucket that's been supported by the National Institutes of Health in the US. Some of it looks at the moderating roles of occupational inflexibility. So with a former postdoc, Patrick Ushizuka, we found that women who work in jobs characterized by a high level of inflexibility in hours are more likely to drop out of work following parenthood, and the same is not true for men. With a graduate student here at Cornell, the same graduate student who has worked with me on the paper I'll present today, Wonjeong Jeong, we've looked at the moderating role, not of own hours, but of partners' long hours. So we find that for women who have a partner who works long hours, she's more likely to exit the labor force. And again, the same does not hold for men. Some of this has been reported elsewhere. This study looks over a long period of time. And one of the main conclusions that comes out of the work is that there's been really little change in that process over time. So, you might think that the asymmetry in how women's and men's labor force is impacted by other household activities or other members of the family, you might think that would become more symmetric over time, and we really don't find evidence that it has. I'll just highlight a couple other things. I have some cross-national work that focuses on the economic costs of parenthood, and some of that is with colleagues at Stockholm University. And that shows that these patterns that we report on and that I'll report on here in the US are really common in other countries, even countries that are characterized by more equal gender relations and much more supportive work-family policies. So that's kind of a broad picture of the project. The paper that I'm going to present today focuses specifically on structural inequality and the relative earnings of husbands and wives after a first birth. And this is motivated by a few things. First is that parenthood is a key turning point. And it's at this point when gender disparities in couples' paid and unpaid work really widen. And so parenthood increasingly is recognized as a key factor in gender inequality in earnings. So whereas childless women are closer in their earnings to men, mothers are much further away. And it's that turning point of parenthood that makes a big difference. The paper is motivated by what we know about systemic gender inequality. So a lot of work and a lot of really good theoretical work points to how the normative expectations of fatherhood as primarily tied to breadwinning and motherhood as primarily tied to care work, how those broad structural features of our understanding of motherhood and fatherhood and its relationship to work, how those things play into couple dynamics. And as I said, there's been really rich theoretical development specifying how that structural gender inequality works. But at the empirical level, a lot of the work's been on individual mechanisms and outcomes, not all of it, but a lot of it. And it leaves open questions about structural aspects of inequality that shape couple dynamics. So that's the primary motivation for taking on this work. So we draw on those theoretical insights and methodological approaches, and we really marry a few distinct lines of work. So one is the gender perspective on the division of labor among couples. And I suspect that's quite familiar to this group, the idea that broad social norms structure the way that mothers and fathers divide paid work and unpaid work. The other line of work is it's more of an emerging line of research that focuses on structural inequalities in health in the United States. And we're going to rely on this line of work to provide kind of a framework or scaffolding for assessing the association between gender systems and outcomes. So this work on structural inequalities conceptualizes discrimination as a set of interconnected institutions that reinforce hierarchies. It's developed concrete measures and shows that US states are institutional actors that set policy and shape norms and opportunities. And, you know, so there's been kind of a renewed interest in US states as political actors. And, you know, it's given like what's going on at the state level and the polarization in the United States that is, you know, where lines are really drawn across state lines, that's probably, you know, not too surprising, but there really hasn't been a lot of emphasis on differences in family patterns across US states. And this is despite the fact that if you look at this, and for example, Ron Lestagi did many years ago as, you know, one really good example of trying to understand differences across US states, you can see that variation in families' patterns and in mothers' labor market outcomes is greater across US states than it is across many countries in Europe. So, you know, the US is a vast terrain and becoming, you know, really more polarized and differentiated across state lines. And so that's, you know, kind of a key insight in thinking about how to better understand structural inequalities. We get quite a bit of leverage by looking at differences across US states. So this emerging literature has produced a growing body of evidence linking negative health to both structural racism, so systemic inequality by race and ethnicity, and sexism, so systemic inequality by gender. So we pick up there. And in particular, we follow Patricia Homan's recent conceptualization of institutional sexism. And she lays this out as operating across multiple domains to constrain women's opportunities and resources. So her work highlights, and this body of work in general highlights the importance of scaling up, aggregating up for understanding health disparities and the salience of states, US states, for structuring opportunities. We focus on indicators at the state level, measured on multiple dimensions, including economic, political, cultural, and reproductive inequality. Distinct from some of the work, really much of the work that's focused on structural inequalities, and even some of the kind of broader theoretical and empirical work on inequality among couples, or gender inequality in the division of labor, we take a life course approach, focus on within family inequality. So we do our analysis at the couple level, and we look at a particular and salient point in the life course, which is the transition to parenthood. So at the couple level, the idea is that the devaluation of women's work plays out in power dynamics that affect bargaining over time and money, plays out in the benefits of specialization, so what wages mothers will garner on the labor market compared to fathers, and adherence to gendered norms. So this pretty pervasive idea that ties fatherhood to breadwinning and motherhood to caregiving about who does what in and out of the household. So the basic premise is that these structural features will be particularly salient at the transition to parenthood when couples renegotiate roles in the family to accommodate new demands on time and money. So I'm going to lay out research questions, but I do want to pause and just invite anyone to ask questions as I go. I have the chat box open and I'll try to pay attention to that. But if I miss a question, please feel free to just unmute and raise your questions or concerns. So I'll pause for a second if anyone has questions on the basic framing, and otherwise I'm going to lay out the research questions and start to tell you how we approach the problem. Okay, stop me if anything needs clarification. So we asked three research questions. The first is how structural features of gender inequality shape within family earnings inequality. So the relative earnings of wives compared to husbands. And I use the term wives and husbands, but we also include cohabiting couples. So wives and husbands is really a shorthand for male and female partners. And because of the long sweep that we're looking at and constraints in the data that I'll talk about, we are focusing on different gender couples. And here, based on what I've outlined, we expect greater declines in her earnings share among couples in states that place less value on the work done by women. So we anticipate that those structural gender inequalities will shape the way that couples decide about paid work following parenthood. The second question asks whether the estimated effects on relative earnings work through changes among wives or husbands. And here the expectations aren't super clear. Some research, for example, by David Padula and Sarah Tabo, suggests that it's going to be women's preferences that are most responsive to policies and norms. And so whatever change we see in relative earnings of couples will be driven by the effects of structural sexism on women's earnings. But an alternative perspective, for example, from Jennifer Hook, suggests that there might be gendered trade-offs. So when you have more egalitarian normative and policy contexts, women may be more inclined to stay in the labor market, and men may be more inclined to pull back, meaning more symmetry in the responses of men and women. So a decline in sexism may result in increased relative earnings among wives because both their earnings go up and their husband's earnings go down. So we'll look at that, and we don't have a strong prior about which of those we might expect. Actually, I kind of have a prior that it would be women's, just because, as I noted in my, brief discussion of other work that falls within this broad project, we're finding a lot of persistence in gendered patterns and relatively modest change over time. So just to kind of provide a little preview of the results. The third question asks whether there would be differences in the kind of intersection of individual characteristics in these structural inequalities. So this draws from an intersectional approach and asks whether more advantaged women are more protected in the context of sexist norms and policies. So here again, there are competing perspectives. There's some work by Fua on discounting. And the idea here is that in a really sexist environment, or where there are really strong structural inequalities by gender, women will benefit less from their own individual assets. So, it suggests that, your relative advantage won't help that much when you're living in a sexist environment. The second model is a financial necessity model, and kind of against a resource model. So, the resource model, which is honestly like where my priors were when I started this broader project, is that, more advantaged women would be more protected. They would have greater advances in gender equality within the home, because they could kind of parlay their resources outside the home to advantage, improve their situation in couple dynamics or couple negotiations. The financial necessity model predicts that less advantaged wives will have higher relative earnings, irrespective of the kind of normative context in which they live and work. And the idea here is that economic vulnerability may dampen couples' responsiveness to the policy and normative environment. So work arrangements in couples who are less socially advantaged and lower income, their decisions to work or not to work may be driven by the financial necessity of dual breadwinning and role sharing. And there is some support for this in qualitative studies in the US that show that even though couples who have less education and lower incomes may have more conservative gender beliefs, on the ground, their actual arrangements look more egalitarian. And the idea is that it's just driven by the necessity that both partners work. And, in that kind of broader project that I described, we find evidence of this, that, women in these couples work regardless of their husband's long hours or their job inflexibility, really because they need to. So we kind of present those various perspectives, and we'll take a look at heterogeneity and the link between structural sexism and couples' earnings. So we use the current population survey panels. You may be familiar with the current population survey. That's the US labor force survey, 60,000 households a month. It's typically treated as a cross-sectional survey. So that's the basis of our reports of changes in employment and health insurance coverage and income and living arrangements. But the design is actually a panel design. And so we draw on that panel design. I'll tell you a little bit more about how it works. But there's some advantages to the data. In particular, you have about 8,500 households per panel. You have 12 panels per year, so they're constantly refreshed. And it has been ongoing for 4 decades. So it's really the longest longitudinal source of data in the United States. It has couple level information, so information on work and earnings of both partners, monthly information with short recall, and we know people's state of residence, and we can aggregate in a representative way up to the state level. So some strong advantages. The design looks like this. It has a 4 months on, 8 months off, 4 months back on design. And at the end of the first 4 months, it asks detailed questions about income and earnings. And then it asks again about income and earnings in the final month. So you have these observations on income a year apart. And what we do is we take those observations on income, work and hours, and we look at childless couples, and we see who transitions to birth in that 1 year interval. So we look at short windows, but we have pre and post observations on couple level work and earnings. So, like I said, many advantages of these data, and of course the short windows are a disadvantage. But less so in the United States than would be the case in other rich countries, because the US has virtually we have no federal paid leave. A few states have implemented short paid leaves, and some are available through employers. But by and large, women who are pregnant before working while they're pregnant work very late into their pregnancy. And for those who do changes after birth, and by and large aren't really contaminated by leaves. So this is what the change in her earnings share looks like over that short window of time. For couples who don't have a first birth, if you look at month in sample 4 and month in sample 8, that's the sort of pre and post period. If you look at share of earnings pre and post, you wouldn't expect much change over the course of a year, short of some life event. And indeed, their earnings share is about 41%. In the second panel, for those who transition to a birth over the course of that year, so experience the significant life transition, earnings share drops from 38 to 30%. So wives lose substantially in terms of the relative earnings. Some of that is due to wives dropping out altogether, and some of that is due to wives cutting back their hours or losing annual hourly wage. We have data over 4 decades, and so some of our analysis focuses on the extent to which we see changes over time in the basic patterns and in associations between structural sexism and her earnings share. So this is just the basic pattern. So I showed you that couples who transition to a first birth, her relative earnings drops from 38% to 31%. And I'm showing you here what that looks like over time. So the pre-measure increases slightly over time, with most of that increase happening in the 1980s, and then kind of consistent with the stalled revolution, much slower change between the 1990s and 2000s. And on the right panel, where you see the post observations, the patterns are mirrored. Her share is just lower. So you can see again that there's more substantial increase in her relative earnings following birth between the 80s and the 90s, but then relative stability. So not a whole lot of progress, particularly since the 1980s. So I noted that we're following Patricia Homan's conceptualization of sexism across the domains, across economic, political, cultural, and reproductive domains. So within the economic domain, we're measuring gender wage penalties and gender employment penalties, as well as pay gaps for female versus male dominated occupations. So we're using CPS data, and we have this for every year, over 40 years, for every state. So we have a file that's like state by year. And we have a lot of variation across states. So I'll show you a little bit of detail on what this looks like. In the political domain, we include weak political representation of women and religious conservatism. So the representation of women is the proportion of state legislators who are men. And this is, again, measured across states and over time, not every single year, but we have many observations over time. Religious conservatism is the proportion evangelical Protestant, which in the US is 59% across these 40 years. So it's a high number. And we have that at the decade level, and we have that for each state. And again, lots of variation in religious conservatism across states, with a lot of conservative evangelical high share in the South, for example, and much less, for example, in the Northeast. In the cultural domain, we use the General Social Survey to assess the disapproval of working mothers. And again, we have this for most states in most years, and we do a little bit of combining by state and region in order to fill in sparse cells. In the reproductive domain, we have restrictive attitudes about abortion. These come as well from the GSS, and we use the same strategy to construct observations by state and time. So we take all of those measures, we standardize them, and we average them to create an index of structural sexism. So this is some descriptive statistics on this state level measure of structural sexism. Like I said, it's an average of standardized measures across the economic, political, cultural, and reproductive domains. It has a high reliability score, and we have variation, like I said, across states and time. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you averages over 40 years. So there's change over time, but there's a fair amount of consistency in who scores high and who scores low across states. So the darker areas score higher on the sexism index, and you can see that those are, tend to be in the South, somewhat in the Midwest. And the lower scoring states are on the Northeast and in the Northeast and West. So that's not so surprising, given what we know about state patterns. On the right-hand side is just box plots showing like mean levels and variation across decades. So the key point here is that it's declining, but decade by decade, there's quite a bit of persistence in all of these indicators. So women earn less. There's quite a lot of there's not many women in politics. They're pretty, even today, restrictive ideas about mothers in the workforce, etc. So to look at the link between structural sexism and relative earnings, we use a fixed effect approach. So it's kind of like it's really equivalent to a change score model. So we look at how wives' earnings change in the pre-period versus the post-period as a function of their transition to first birth interacted with structural sexism. That's our key measure. How does structural sexism shape the effect of birth on relative earnings? That term in red is our key estimand. We control for how first birth is moderated by decade and how first birth is moderated by other state characteristics. So we account for like those interactions that may confound our key estimate of interest. You'll stop me if you have questions. Okay. So this is like,
sorry.
Yeah, please jump in.
I have a quick clarification question.
Yeah.
So you're modeling parents and non-parents together in this equation?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So everybody's coupled, and I'm looking at how among all of those couples, how the transition to birth shapes relative earnings and how that association depends on the level of structural sexism in a state. And I should have said too that a key feature of this model is that it accounts for year and state fixed effects. So we have a couple fixed effects in the model, but because the time period is short and our sample remains largely in place over that 1 year period, the fixed effects effectively also account for year and state fixed effects. So we're kind of doing our best to isolate that moderating role of sexism among couples.
And can you say, well, I don't mean like say now, but do you know anything whether these populations are comparable, parents and
Those who do
non-parents?
and don't transition.
Yeah, those who transition versus those who don't transition.
Yeah, it's a great question. So this is kind of one way to think about that. So in the pre-period, those who go on to have a first birth have slightly lower relative earnings. So there's, there seems to be a slight difference between them. There may be here, given our short panels, some couples who are already anticipating the transition to birth. We also looked at how structural sexism shapes the transition to birth. And there's a very small association between those two pieces as well. So there's, some indication that there may be some differences, but small, as far as we can tell. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, partially. I mean, I'm curious about that because I have a similar paper under review. Well, not similar in the sense that it's on structural issues, but like a paper where I compare parents and non-parents, but I do it in a way where I construct this placebo parents, like match populations of parents. And that's like a little bit more convincing, but to me,
Yeah.
but I also, I'm not super familiar with this approach you're presenting, so I'm curious to learn more.
Yeah, I mean, I've used that approach in past papers too, where we've taken couples who will transition later and, use them as like a placebo. We don't observe couples long enough here to do that. I'm trying to remember, we looked at some other indicators that would help us to try to figure this out. Many couples in the US transition relatively quickly after getting married. And so, within this group, there are some who will never transition, but most of them will transition relatively quickly, after we observe, the transitions within the observed window.
Yeah, if I can say one more thing, because I don't want to stop you for too long, is that one thing that I really like about this like placebo event approach is that it allows you to examine anticipatory behavior. And at least from what I see now, I'm not sure if this is like possible with this approach. And at least my paper is for Poland, and we found a large degree of anticipatory behavior. And I would assume that in the US it's probably even more pronounced, because here there is like probably a larger, extent of labor market protection, etc. Not as big as in other European welfare states, but still, yeah. So that's an issue that I discovered, and I'm certainly curious about that.
Yeah. So I have some work with Pilar Gonalons-Pons and Christine Schwartz that relies on a different data source to look at changes in employment and earnings around the time of a birth. And we can do that over a longer span of time and at a monthly level. So it allows us to look at what that anticipatory behavior is. And women do start adjusting their labor market behavior a few months before birth. So we're capturing, some of that here. But it is also true that, women who are working do, by and large, work late into their pregnancy. And so, we're capturing some, but I think it's relatively small.
Okay, I'll take a look at that paper then. Thanks.
Yeah, you'll see in finer grain detail, what happens in months leading up to and after. So this is the key, key finding. We show that wives' earnings share after birth is shaped by state level sexism. So we find that about a 1 unit change in this sexism index, remember mean 0, standard deviation 1, a 1 unit change, a standard deviation change in this sexism index results in a 2 percentage point decline in wives' earnings share. And, that's just depicted on the figure on the right. So the typical earnings share is about 41%. Among mothers, it drops from around 38 to 28 or so for those who were in low sexism versus high sexism states. So it's not insubstantial. It's a moderating association that has a meaningful impact on women's and men's couples behavior. So what's driving the change in the share? So obviously, like, the relative share is a function of both her earnings and his earnings. And I'd mentioned early in the talk that it wasn't entirely clear from the literature whose earnings would be driving the change, whether it would come from women entirely, or whether there would be some gender trade-offs in women's and men's earnings. What we find here, this is results from separate models predicting women's and men's log earnings. And in this, first column are her earnings, and the second column are his earnings. And you can see that structural sexism has a meaningful impact on her earnings and is not associated with his. In fact, men's earnings really aren't affected by the transition to first birth. So, men keep kind of humming along in their work and earnings, even after this major transition to parenthood. Her earnings drop substantially after first birth, and more so in states where gender inequality is high. So this shows on the right-hand panel, the graph, the light line is men. You can see that, his earnings remain relatively flat over the transition to parenthood and aren't moderated by structural sexism. Her earnings decline, and more so in states that have high levels of structural sexism. So what's driving change? It's her behavior. Are the socially advantaged more protected? So again, I had kind of noted there are different ways of thinking about this. Thinking about those with less education, fewer resources, maybe having more of a need to work and being less affected by sexism. In contrast, women with more social advantage being able to kind of protect themselves from these structural features of inequality. And really, we see kind of strikingly similar estimates. These are just estimates from a three-way interaction that we added to the main model that interacts first birth by sexism, our key measure in previous slides, also by individual indicators of social advantage. And I'm showing just the three-way indicators, and you can see for no college degree and college degree, very similar estimates. For white and other racialized groups, very similar estimates. And for mothers who were less than 30 at birth and older than 30 at birth, very similar estimates. So the bottom line is that we find little evidence that women's own individual characteristics moderate this impact of sexism after the birth of a child. And then, do associations change over time? We have 40 years of data, and the thinking on my part would be, well, things are getting better. Women are more attached to the labor market. They're earning more relative to their husbands. And sexism has reduced, but its association with how couples manage the transition to parenthood has not. If anything, there's some suggestive evidence that sexism is increasing over time. So again, we took the main model, we added a three-way interaction, first birth by sexism, it's our main indicator, times decade. So is this moderating role of sexism after first birth different across decades? There are no significantly different, there are no statistically significant differences, but there's some suggestive evidence that mothers' earnings after birth are lower relative to fathers in more sexist states in more recent periods relative to earlier periods. And then I think this is my final slide, and or just to getting close to the end of the hour. And I'll flash this up pretty quickly. So we have just a year of data. We have a pre and post observation that's separated by a year. So I think, a question is, well, so what? This is a short-term adjustment, and what does it look like several years out? So here we expand our sample and we look at all parents with a kid less than 10. And on the left-hand side is just descriptives. So, without a kid, women earn about 41% of family earnings. With a kid, 0 to 2, about 29%, 3 to 5, 27%, 6 to 9, 27%. So those are just basic descriptives. If we put those into a model, we find strikingly similar detriments to income by the age of the oldest child, about 8% lower in her share of earnings. And we also find pretty strikingly similar moderating effects of sexism by the age of the oldest child. So, this suggests to me that these effects persist, and they persist over quite a long time. So I'm just going to wrap up really quick so we have some time for discussion. Kind of a few key summary points. First is that macro level structural explanations do seem to be important, meaningfully important for understanding couple level processes. States, US states, shape within couple inequality, and that's even after accounting for couple fixed effects and the moderating role of state composition. So our panels are short, but we are able to provide some leverage on potential confounders, and these moderating effects hold up. We know that family dynamics are critical to widening gender inequality and earnings over the life course. And we've seen too that these are slow to change. So, as I mentioned, my broader project shows that. And, I think here, the level of change that we find over 40 years is really pretty modest. I guess, one bright light to take out of this is that state policy is a potential lever. So states do have a meaningful impact on the way that couples organize their work and family lives. And so, given that household negotiations are structured by context, it's not just about individual wages and pre-birth earnings, but the structure of inequality, opportunities, and norms. Those are things that should be, in principle, modifiable at the state level. And, we've seen some movement on that front with, like I said, limited and not super generous, but nonetheless paid leaves at the state level. States are doing more to address gaps in work family policy that haven't been addressed at the federal level. I'm happy to take questions or suggestions or concerns. This is very much work in progress, so very happy to hear from you.